Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, libertarian guy. But basically what I want to do is talk about identity politics, because I'm a libertarian. I hang out in libertarian circles, and you get a diverse sort of response when you want to talk about things like race, gender, and anyone who knows me knows I'm pretty... In the libertarian world, I'm a pretty just sort of down the line libertarian. I wouldn't consider myself a left libertarian. I wouldn't consider myself a right libertarian. I just like to have nuanced conversations about the issues of the day. And I'm not shy about exploring those nuances. But people always have a visceral reaction when it comes to the term identity. And they're like, well, we're libertarians and identity politics is antithetical to libertarianism because we're about the individual, so it doesn't matter what you are. And while I agree with that in the sense that your rights, your right to having your property, your right to not having violence acted upon you, it is not determined by the fact, by whatever aspect of who you are. It doesn't. But that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a conversation to be had. It doesn't necessarily mean the fact that there are aspects of who we are that affect the reality around us, not because of who we are, but because of the context in which we live in and the presuppositions that people have. So it's a different conversation. There's a difference between identity, a conversation about identity, versus a conversation identity politics. I do think identity politics in the sense that people trying to score easy political points through sort of platitudes to identity without actually having any real kind of conversation, but just sort of being like, yeah, race, gender, equality, yeah, without having a really discussion what these things mean and what the reality is and where we are and where we're going and all this stuff. That is just cheap political points and does have an effect of creating a very unsubstantive discussion that can oftentimes be divisive, because you're just rushing to some sort of conclusion without having any real conversation of how you got there. And that's just politics. Politics, but it's not just identity issues. It's all issues. Okay, politicians of all stripes, on issues that I agree on and issues that I disagree on, they have a tendency of reducing issues to something that lacks any kind of substance that makes it more divisive, because it becomes black and white. And that's just the nature of politics. That's why I'm just sort of, my grander goal is to shift sort of how we discuss things in society, how we solve things in society outside of sort of that political electoral realm, because just the nature of it is to dumb down conversations, because again, you're trying to build this sort of majority vote, and then because you only need 51%, you can demonize the other 49%. So you end up with this sort of very divisive cycle, and that I am truly, truly loathsome of. Okay, which is why partly why I'm a Libertarian Party member, because I'm not in this to sit there and say, hey, we can get 51%, and I don't, by all means, is to change the culture of not just politics, but of how society talks and solves and thinks about its issues. Okay. So again, now we've established sort of the difference between sort of identity and identity politics. But identity is a real thing, in the sense that, everyone is a human, everyone's an individual, everyone gets the same rights. But the fact that there are things that make us who we are has an effect on not just who we are, but how the world sees us, treats us, etc. And also the world around us shapes how we see. And this is an important thing. And in a couple of videos back, I was kind of talking about sort of the difference between, because you always get people who get sensitive saying, like, well, why do we get to talk about that identity but not this identity? Because I think a lot of people get confused sort of where identity comes from. And oftentimes identity doesn't exist because suddenly the people who have that identity want to talk about it. Okay, like I don't realize that I'm Latino because I thought, oh, look, one day I'm Latino. It's usually because the world around you thrusts identity on you. The fact that people point out that you're different, and that makes that your identity in a sense. Usually your identity, like, for example, I've always been kind of chubby, and when I was pretty chubby as a little kid, I didn't really think about it much. But the rest of the world kept pointing out, hey, Alex, you're a fatty, fat, and said mean things. But because of that, I suddenly had this identity as the fat kid or as the poor kid or whatnot. It wasn't that these are identities that I just decided to come to and embrace on my own. It was because that's what other people saw. That's what other people responded to about me, which doesn't necessarily have much to do with who I am as my personality. These things do shape my experiences and shape the lens at which I look at the world. But and that's the thing. So things like blackness, queerness, they've become identities oftentimes not because everyone was looking to form these sort of lenses, but because people saw these people as different and kept reminding them that they're different, these identities arose. And that's why sort of like there's a difference between sort of the idea of whiteness. Okay, nowadays maybe nowadays you can maybe argue that there's a white consciousness emerging, but for the longest time there was just basically that was sort of the default. No one thought of themselves as necessarily white. They would think of themselves as I'm Irish, I'm German, or or you think I'm a baseball player, or I'm and that's sort of the benefit of that was sort of the difference in the sense that that's the default. So in that case, people look to other things to develop the way they see your identity. Okay, be like, oh, okay, well, Bob, he's the Dungeons and Dragons kid. Okay, or Steve, yeah, he's the football player. Okay, versus let's say someone with a different identity, then they become sort of the Latino Dungeons and Dragons kid. But no, it's not. The Latino comes first. So that's and again, it's not. I'm not saying that people are bad or good, but this is just the reality of sort of how these identities come to be. Okay, and why these issues kind of arise, because that sort of consciousness, that awareness that there's this thing about you that people see and react to, is not something that you chose to acknowledge. The world kind of makes you acknowledge it. Okay, and that's why I think probably my experience was, I had some experiences that sort of, again, informed my identity, but I don't think my experience was quite as, what's the word? I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but as at a greater degree as a lot of other people. And I was fortunate in that sense. So basically my identity isn't as tethered to an idea of, let's say, ethnicity or something like that. But I understand why other people's are. I understand that sort of, when people keep saying this and that, and what you see around you is this and that, that's going to happen. It's just psychologically you're going to think of that. In the same way, someone who grows up in Appalachia, their identity as an Appalachian is going to be very visible because, or if you're an Amish person, your identity as an Amish is going to be very strong because people are going to see that very, very quickly. Then they're going to be quick to, point it out and ask questions. So again, it's the consciousness, sort of the reality of identity is born out of the behavior of others towards those who sort of fall in this category. So that's where sort of like this distinction comes in, and I think where like the nuance of conversation is. And the thing is that how we treat people when we talk about, and that's the other thing, like when it comes to like race specifically, things like racism, or actually any ism, sexism, whatnot, there isn't like, you can find a concrete definition. But when people are conversing, they're using all sorts of different definitions. So you might have some people who are using sort of a more heady power dynamic conversation where they're saying, well, sexism and racism is more of an issue of sort of the power in society. So, like it's about how institutions are structured and, which groups sort of kind of have more power over, social means, in the sense like, who has more political power, economic power, and how this kind of reflects reality. That's one way to look at it. But other people, when they hear racism, they don't necessarily have such a sophisticated view of racism, sexism. They're going to sit there and think, well, you're telling me, I'm thinking, okay, you're saying I don't like people of a different category. So when you call someone racist, you're saying that I hate people, and they're thinking I don't hate people. when, other people might be meaning, oh, you're reinforcing sort of current sort of power relationships. And then this is where like a lot of conversations go off the handle because people don't ever take a moment to sort of define terms. And then again, there's this other one where it's just like racism just as anything that just basically distinguishes or acknowledges the existence of race. So, and that's, these are very sort of fluffy terms that shift around a lot and make a lot of these conversations not very productive. So that's the thing, like, and then also when people start talking about like who can and can't be racist or sexist, like I don't find that super productive either, because again, they're having two different conversations. They're saying one person's really trying to say, okay, well, power dynamics, the powerful aren't the powerless. Well, another person's thinking, wait, you're saying other people can't hate people? And then these are two different conversations. Again, it's just the definitions. And again, this is just from observing how people sort of interact when they discuss these issues. And I'm just like, I think they're arguing two different things and they're arguing past each other. And if people just sat down, took a moment to make sure that everyone's on the same page of what words mean, they'd have much more productive conversations. And again, you can acknowledge all these things. I acknowledge that there are, inequities of power throughout society between, which do fall in line, racial, gender, identities. They're not necessarily in a vacuum either. It's not like, okay, all race inequities are because of race and not all gender are they in part? I would imagine so. I think anecdotally we've all kind of experienced some of these sort of just difference in the way we treat each other. It's not necessarily very drastic or very as pernicious as oftentimes or as it has been or as it's portrayed to still be, but it's there and it's worth talking about. Now, do I think necessarily the government's going to be able to just fix it through some sort of magic wand policy? Not really. It really comes down to just sort of social trends just change over generations. And that's the thing, everyone wants to change right away. But it comes down to we are much different. Like my generation's much different sort of in how we see each other than the previous generation and vice versa. Okay, I mean, you go back years and years and years ago, I mean, you had all sorts of different other groups that were in a conflict stage. And those conflicts dissipate, those differences become less noticeable over generations as we grow up with each other. And that's just sort of the natural evolution of sort of, what's the term I'm looking for? Multiculturalism. Okay, I mean, you add whenever you add something sort of newer to the mix, it will take time for it to become part of the fabric. Now, some are going to take longer than others because sometimes just history. Some history is harder to get over than others for as a society, but as we grow up with each other, our children grow up with each other, they're going to have a different view than their parents did, and it just kind of goes on generation to generation. What we can do always, if we want to sort of make that better, is to be willing to have that conversation, but realize that, as a libertarian, it still doesn't justify violence, use of force. But again, I think a lot of people find, like, as a libertarian, discussing norms to be somehow saying that, hey, you like one norm or another norm, somehow automatically means that you want to enforce that through the state, or you believe that compulsion should be used to enforce those norms. And that's, I think, oftentimes where the conversation gets off the road between libertarians, because some libertarians just want to keep the conversation away from norms, and then and oftentimes it's not even necessarily that they want to, it's just they don't like when the conversation goes to norms they don't like, and it goes both ways. When some libertarians say they're comfortable with these norms and they're like, oh no, I don't like you, and then when other libertarians say the opposite, no, I don't like you, and that's just not a productive conversation. At the end of the day, in a sort of libertarian world, norms go through the market process like anything else. The norms that are most compelling, that provide the most value to the most people, are going to win out. And to me, that just does kind of over time is going to be a more inclusive norm. It's going to be sort of a more diverse norm, because for all intents and purposes, it's going to provide the most value to the most people, quite obviously, not just in our socialness in the sense of who we have relationships with, who we get to have share experiences with, and the richness of those experiences, but also economically. I mean, again, the more people you can interact with, the more people you can sell stuff and give stuff to, and just the nature of just also our economic interest is going to lead, to me, would eventually lead to a more inclusive world, because people start seeing the economic interest of that. And then again, you take a look at how certain sort of power dynamics that fall along racial, gender lines over time, oftentimes it's prevented that economic aspect from happening, because it's prevented economic interaction of those groups that they wanted to kind of suppress. Okay, preventing certain groups from being able to have jobs, from being able to own property, from having those little tiny economic pieces of power that would naturally create a more inclusive world. Because more people who have jobs, more people who have money, who buy stuff, and the more businesses are going to try to cater to everybody and create a more inclusive sort of narrative. So oftentimes, a lot of those sort of disparities in the way we see each other and the way certain, intergenerational wealth is built up and these kind of things have not been necessarily purely because the market, okay? You always have those people who try to shoehorn, the discussion of race and identity into some sort of critique of capitalism, which, no matter how you think about it, there's not much there to grab onto. There are differences in economic power among people of different identities is a thing, but oftentimes it's because of the historical prevention of economic participation, not because of the open economic participation that exists more broadly now. Okay, so at the end of the day, a more open economy where people can more broadly participate as consumers, producers, and whatnot is always going to just make sense that it's going to achieve a sort of a more inclusive and reduce sort of social tensions among different groups, because everyone becomes somebody you want to get along with, because they may be the person who sells you something worth buying, or someone who might buy something from you, or might find something worth buying from you. Okay, so what is an argument is that the interests of who's currently powerful will sometimes subvert the state to prevent the economic participation of other groups. But that's a critique of abuse of power, of state abuse, not a critique of the fundamentals of a broader open market. And that's why I try to avoid the word capitalism, because capitalism, in some people's mind, doesn't necessarily mean a broader open market with free exchange. It just, to them, capitalism just represents sort of this state where current large economic interests have control over the rules. And that's another, again, comes down to definitions. How do we define our terms? So that's why I generally avoid the word capitalism in my conversations, because while to allow libertarians like myself, we hear the word capitalism, we're thinking, okay, free markets, open enterprise, broad economic participation, unhindered. That's not what other people are thinking. So when we argue, they're thinking of some sort of hierarchical, top-down, cronyistic system. So then if I were to sit there and argue to defend capitalism, they think I'm sort of defending sort of the status quo, oppressive systems that be, which I'm not. So basically what it comes down to is there are issues to talk about. There are things to discuss, but, you can do so as a libertarian. You can do so as a right or left libertarian and have productive conversations around these issues. You just have to sit down and talk definitions, make sure you're clear on what you're talking about. And you can have some valuable conversations. If you haven't listened to my last few episodes about race and gender identity and things like that, I highly recommend go watching them. I think they're of value. It'll just reiterate a lot of the points I made in this one, but also some other points. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.